The ground was frozen solid, but Margaret Sullivan dug anyway. Her hands, once soft from keeping house in Ohio, were cracked and bleeding. She had just finished burying her husband. A simple cross made from the broken spokes of their wagon wheel marked the spot. Mama, little James, just 5 years old, tugged at her skirt. His face was pinched, his eyes wide with a confusion that cut her deeper than the cold. When is Papa coming back? Margaret's heart seized. She knelt in the snow, the cold soaking through her thin dress, and pulled her son into a desperate hug. Papa's gone to heaven, sweet boy. It's just us now. The attack had been 3 days ago. It felt like a lifetime. Bandits, desperate men, their faces hidden by grime and greed, had swarmed their small wagon train at dawn. Thomas had fought. Lord, how he'd fought. His rifle had cracked in the gray light, a lonely sound against their savage yells. But there were too many. She could still hear the wet thud of the bullet that took him, still see the look of pure surprise in his eyes as he fell. Now the other wagons were gone, the other families, scattered or dead. Margaret had hidden with James under their own overturned wagon, her hand clamped over his mouth to stifle his cries, praying to a God who seemed to have turned his back on the Montana territory. When the silence finally returned, she crawled out to a world of ruin. They had taken everything, the horses, the food, even the good boots off Thomas's feet. She stood on trembling legs. The nearest town, Cedar Falls, was 20 miles away, 20 miles through Blackfoot Pass. 2 days' walk in good weather, Thomas had said, tracing the route on a map just a week before. But this wasn't good weather. This was the teeth of winter, and she had a child to carry. She salvaged what little was left, a bag of cornmeal, a handful of dried beans, Thomas's rifle, and a few precious cartridges. She wrapped James in every blanket she could find, turning him into a small, waddling bundle of wool. We're going on an adventure, she told him, the lie tasting like ash in her mouth. They set off into the endless white. The snow was knee-deep. Her skirts dragged like anchors. Every hour felt like a day. The forest was a silent, watching thing. Ancient pines groaned under the weight of snow. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Wolves, bears, or worse, more men like the ones who had killed her husband. By midday, they had maybe covered 3 miles. James whimpered constantly. He was shivering despite the layers. Her own feet were numb things at the end of her legs. She found a fallen log and collapsed, pulling James onto her lap. Hungry, Mama, he whispered. She mixed a handful of cornmeal with snow, a pitiful, gritty paste. She watched him eat it, a knot of guilt tightening in her stomach. Their food wouldn't last. At this pace, the journey would take a week, maybe more. They would never make it. As the shadows grew long and terrifying, she heard it, a sound that every traveler on the frontier dreaded, the howl of a wolf. Then another, closer. Fear, cold and sharp, shot through her. She scrambled to her feet, hauling James up. We need shelter, she muttered, her eyes darting through the darkening trees. There, a cluster of rocks, forming a shallow cave. It wasn't much, but it would have to do. Her fingers were clumsy with cold as she gathered pine needles and branches. The matches were damp. It took a dozen precious strikes to coax a tiny flame to life. The fire was pathetic, a flicker of hope against a universe of cold. Night fell like a black stone. The wolves howled again, their eyes glinting just beyond the firelight. They were circling, waiting. She held the rifle across her knees, her hands shaking too badly to ever aim it. Tell me a story, Mama, James whispered, pressing against her. About Papa. Her throat tightened. Your Papa was the bravest man in all of Ohio. He could build anything, and he loved you more than all the stars in the sky. The fire began to die. The wood was too wet. She fed it the last of their kindling, knowing that when the light went out, they were lost. The cold would take them, or the wolves would. She prayed a silent, desperate plea, and that's when she heard it. A new sound, not the wind, not the wolves. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate, crunching through the snow, getting closer. Margaret raised the rifle, her heart hammering against her ribs. Who's there? She called, her voice a ragged crack. Stay back, I'm armed. The footsteps stopped, and from the shadows a figure emerged that made her blood run cold. He was a giant, broader than any man she'd ever seen, wrapped in a thick bearskin coat that made him seem part of the wilderness itself. A wild beard, tangled with ice, covered his face. His eyes reflected the firelight, glowing like a predator's. He held a long rifle in one hand, like it was a toy. Margaret's finger tightened on the trigger. "I said stay back." The mountain man's gaze swept over their pathetic camp. The dying fire, the shivering child, the rifle shaking in her hands. When he spoke, his voice was a low growl, rough from disuse. "That fire will be dead in an hour. You'll be dead an hour after that." "We'll manage," she lied. He took a step closer. She could smell him now. Wood smoke, grease, and something wild and dangerous. The wolves had gone silent. Even they seemed to fear this man. "Where's your man?" he asked. "Dead. Bandits. 3 days ago." Something flickered in his eyes. Not pity, recognition. He glanced at James, who was hiding behind her skirts. "You alone?" Margaret lifted her chin. "We're heading to Cedar Falls. We don't need your help." The man laughed, a harsh, grinding sound. "Cedar Falls is 5 days from here in good weather. You got food for 5 days? You got the strength to carry that boy through drifts deeper than you are tall?" Her silence was all the answer he needed. He moved then, impossibly fast for a man his size. Before she could even think to shoot, he'd knocked the rifle from her hands. He loomed over her, so close she could see the scars crisscrossing his face. "Your body is mine until I have my sons," he growled. The words hung in the frozen air like a death sentence. Margaret's world tilted. This was it. A fate worse than the wolves, worse than the cold. She wanted to scream, to run, but where could she go? James whimpered, clinging to her leg. And that sound, that tiny sound of her son's fear, held her in place. Pride was a luxury she could no longer afford. Survival was all that mattered now. Her survival was his survival. The mountain man stepped back, his glowing eyes reading her thoughts. "You come with me, or you die here. Choose." Margaret looked at James, at his pale face and blue-tinged lips. She looked at the dying fire, at the darkness pressing in, filled with unseen teeth. Then she looked back at the beast of a man who held their lives in his hands. She made the only choice a mother could. "We'll come," she whispered. The mountain man nodded once. He kicked snow over the embers of their fire, plunging them into near-total darkness. He slung her meager pack over his shoulder as if it weighed nothing. "Keep up," he growled and turned, melting into the forest. Margaret lifted James, her arms already screaming in protest, and stumbled after the broad, bearskin-clad back. Behind them, the wolves began to howl again, a mournful, lonely sound. It felt like a funeral song for the life she had known. The journey was a nightmare. The man who called himself Josiah never slowed. He moved through the darkness like he was born to it, an internal compass guiding him through the treacherous, snow-choked terrain. After what felt like an eternity, he stopped at the base of a steep ridge. "Give me the boy," he commanded. Margaret clutched James tighter. "I can carry him." Josiah turned, his eyes glinting in the faint moonlight. "You can barely carry yourself. Give him to me or we'll all freeze to death on this mountain." With trembling hands, she passed her son over. James, too exhausted to protest, was tucked inside the man's massive coat like a bear cub. Josiah then grabbed her wrist, his grip like iron. "Hold on, don't let go." They climbed, up and up, through trees so thick the sky was a distant memory. Her feet slipped, her lungs burned, but his grip never failed. Just as she thought she would collapse, as the first pale hint of dawn touched the sky, they emerged into a clearing. And there, built against the mountain itself, was a log cabin. Smoke curled from a stone chimney. The sight was so beautiful, so impossible, it nearly brought her to her knees. He pushed the heavy door open and ushered them inside. The warmth was a shock, a physical blow that made her skin sting. The cabin was one large room, the walls covered in animal pelts. A huge stone fireplace crackled with a healthy blaze. Josiah set James down by the fire and shrugged off his coat. He was even more imposing without it, a man made of muscle and scars. "Sit," he ordered, pointing to a rough-hewn bench. He moved to a corner and began preparing food, cutting chunks of venison into a pot. "I'm Margaret," she said, finding her voice. "This is James." He just grunted in reply. Soon the smell of stew filled the tiny cabin, a scent so rich it made her dizzy with hunger. He ladled it into wooden bowls. "Eat." She fed James first, spooning the hot broth between his lips until some color returned to his cheeks. Then she ate, forcing herself not to devour it like a starved animal. Josiah watched them, his dark eyes unreadable. When they were done, he stood. "The boy sleeps there," he said, pointing to a pile of furs by the fire. "You sleep there." He gestured to a bed in the corner. Margaret's chest tightened. "Where will you sleep?" "I don't sleep much." He took his rifle and moved to the door. "Don't try to run. You wouldn't make it a mile." Then he was gone, disappearing back into the gray dawn. Margaret settled James into the warm furs. He was asleep instantly. She sat beside him, trying to make sense of her new prison. It was a strange prison, one with a warm fire and a full belly. She looked around the cabin. Tools hung neatly on the walls. Shelves were stocked with supplies. It was the home of a man who knew how to survive. But there were other things that didn't fit. On a high shelf, almost hidden, were books. Real leather-bound books. On the mantelpiece sat a half-finished wood carving of a horse. Who was this Josiah Reed before the wilderness had taken him? Exhaustion finally claimed her. She curled up on the bed, which smelled of pine and wood smoke, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. She woke to the rhythmic crack of an axe splitting wood. Through the single window she saw Josiah working, his powerful body moving with brutal efficiency. He was building a woodpile as tall as he was. James stirred by the fire. "Mama, where are we?" "We're safe," she said, and the word felt surprisingly true. Josiah entered, his arms piled high with wood. He didn't speak, but went straight to preparing their breakfast. Johnny cakes, more venison, and a spoonful of molasses for James. "Thank you," she said as they ate. He just looked at her as if she'd spoken a different language. After the meal, he stood before her, his presence filling the small room. "You remember what I said last night, what I claimed." Her hands clenched in her lap. "I remember. Mountain law is different from town law. A man takes a woman, she's his. You understand?" She met his wild gaze. "I understand you saved our lives. I understand my son is warm and fed. That is all I understand right now." Something flickered in his eyes. Respect. "You'll work for your keep," he said. "Cooking, mending, tending the fire. You try to run, I'll track you down." Days fell into a strange rhythm. Josiah would leave at dawn to check his traps, returning with meat. Margaret cooked and cleaned, turning this rough cabin into something resembling a home. James, with the resilience of a child, began to treat the place as an adventure, his fear of the mountain man slowly turning into a wary curiosity. Then the blizzard hit. For 3 days the wind howled like a demon, driving snow against the cabin. The temperature plummeted. Ice formed on the inside of the walls. "Mama, I'm cold," James whimpered from his pile of furs. Margaret added another pelt, but he kept shivering. She looked helplessly at Josiah. Without a word, he rose and dragged all the furs into one large pile in front of the fireplace. "We sleep here tonight. All of us. Body heat is all that will keep us alive." Margaret stiffened, but she knew he was right. She settled James in the middle, then lay beside him. Josiah stretched out on the boy's other side, a massive wall of warmth against the raging storm. James fell asleep quickly, safe between them. Margaret lay awake, intensely aware of the man beside her, this strange, dangerous man who was, for now, their protector. "Why do you live out here alone?" she asked the darkness. The silence stretched. She thought he wouldn't answer. "Easier than living with people," he finally said. "Were you always alone?" "No." The word was harsh, final. But after another long silence, he spoke again, his voice a low rumble. "Had a cabin in Wyoming, had a family." He said nothing more, but he didn't have to. Margaret understood loss. She understood the kind of grief that could drive a man into the heart of the wilderness, seeking a silence to match the one in his own soul. She realized with a start that she was no longer just his captive. In the heart of the storm, huddled together for survival, They were something else. Something she didn't have a name for yet. When the blizzard finally broke, the world was buried in white. Josiah dug them out and went to check his traps, leaving her and James alone in the profound silence. Margaret stood in the doorway, watching him go. The thought of escape didn't even cross her mind. Where would she go? This cabin, this prison, was now the safest place in the world. And James. Her son was thriving. He was rosy-cheeked and strong, playing with a small wooden bear Josiah had carved and left by his sleeping furs. That evening, Josiah returned dragging a deer. As he butchered it outside, Margaret watched through the window, fascinated by his efficient, practiced movements. He caught her watching, and instead of anger, he motioned her outside. "You need to learn," he said, "in case something happens to me." So she stood in the biting cold, her stomach turning, as he taught her how to skin and butcher an animal. It was a brutal lesson, but a necessary one. This was their life now. That night, as they ate fresh venison, James looked up at Josiah. "Can you teach me to trap rabbits?" Josiah studied the boy. "You're small." "I'm strong," James insisted, flexing a tiny arm. A flicker of something, not quite a smile but a softening, crossed Josiah's weathered face. "Maybe, when the snow melts some." James beamed. Margaret felt something in her own chest loosen. They were captives, yes, but they were alive. They were a strange, broken little unit, but they were surviving. As she tucked James in that night, he whispered, "I like it here, Mama. Mr. Josiah is teaching me things." She smoothed his hair, her heart a tangle of emotions. She looked over at Josiah, sitting by the fire, his big hands surprisingly gentle as he carved another wooden animal. Fear was no longer the only thing she felt in this cabin. Something else was taking its root, something warmer and far more complicated. Winter tightened its grip. The days grew shorter, the cold more intense. Margaret's hands grew calloused, her body stronger. She learned to read the sky, to predict the weather from the whisper of the wind. Josiah was a harsh teacher. He let her fail, let her struggle before showing her the right way. "Crying won't keep you warm," he'd say. "Doing will." But she began to see the care beneath his stern exterior. The best cuts of meat always went to her and James. He carved a whole set of wooden animals for the boy. He always made sure the woodpile was high, a bulwark against the unexpected. One afternoon, while he was out on his trap lines, she decided to organize the shelves. Behind a sack of flour, she found a small wooden trunk. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, were the remnants of another life. A woman's dress, faded blue, a tiny pair of child's shoes, and a photograph. A young woman with kind eyes holding a small boy on her lap. At the bottom of the trunk was a Bible. In the front, written in a careful hand, Josiah Reed and Mary Reed, married June 12, 1867. Samuel Reed, born March 3, 1868. Margaret stared at the faces in the photograph. This wild creature of the mountains had been a husband, a father. Understanding flooded her. The silence, the solitude, the harshness. It was all a shield, a wall built around a broken heart. She put everything back, her hands trembling. That night she looked at Josiah with new eyes. "Mr. Josiah," James piped up at dinner, "will you teach me to read tracks?" Josiah looked at the boy, and Margaret saw a flash of raw pain in his eyes before it was gone. "Snow's got to be right. You learn by watching." "I'll watch real good," James said. "Well," Margaret corrected gently, "you'll watch very well." Josiah's gaze shifted to her. "Boy needs to learn mountain talk. He also needs to learn proper grammar if he's ever going to—" She stopped. If he was ever going to leave. Return to civilization. The silence was heavy. Josiah stood abruptly. "Storm's coming." He was right. That night the wind shrieked and the cabin groaned. Margaret woke to find the fire almost out, smoke pouring back down the chimney. As she struggled with it, coughing and weeping in frustration, Josiah was suddenly there. He adjusted the damper, rebuilt the fire with an expert hand, and soon the room was warm again. "Why didn't you wake me?" she asked. "You were learning," he said simply. "You could have let us freeze. But you didn't, and you won't make that mistake again." He was teaching her to survive, Not with words, but with hard, unforgettable lessons. The storm raged for 3 days, trapping them inside. On the second night, James asked the question Margaret had been wondering. Mr. Josiah, why don't you have any children? The cabin fell silent, except for the howling wind. Josiah's hands stilled on the trap he was mending. Had a boy once, he said, his voice quiet, about your size. Where is he now? James asked with the innocent cruelty of a child. Gone. Him and his ma. Fever took them. 8 winters back. The grief in the room was a living thing. I'm sorry, James said softly. My papa's gone too. Bad men shot him. Josiah looked at the boy for a long, long moment. Then he reached into a pouch and pulled out a piece of elk antler. See this? I'm going to show you how to carve something from it. Something special. As Margaret watched the giant, scarred man gently guide her son's small hands with the knife, her heart ached with an emotion she couldn't name. This captor, this wild man, was showing her son a tenderness she never would have expected. He was becoming something more, something that terrified and thrilled her all at once. When the storm finally broke, the world was dangerously transformed. Snowdrifts were as high as the cabin roof. Need meat, Josiah announced. Storm drives the elk down. I'll have to go. Margaret's heart sank. He would be gone for days, leaving them alone. He seemed to read her mind. He spent the morning showing her how to clear a blocked chimney where the emergency supplies were hidden. If I'm not back in 4 days, he said, follow the creek down to the valley. There's a trading post. Tell them Josiah Reed sent you. You're coming back, she said, the words a command, not a question. He looked at her, a strange expression on his face. Planning on it, but the mountains don't always care about plans. He left at dawn. The cabin felt vast and empty without him. The silence was unnerving. That night, James asked her to tell him about Ohio, about houses with glass windows and neighbors you could see from your porch. Will we go back there, Mama? She looked around the rough cabin that had become their world. I don't know, sweet boy. Would you want to? He thought for a moment. I like it here. Mr. Josiah is teaching me important things. On the third night of Josiah's absence, Margaret woke to a scratching sound at the door. Her blood ran cold. Wolves. The scratching came again, followed by a low whine. Peering through a crack in the door, she saw a lone wolf in the moonlight. But it was hurt. It was holding up one paw, and a dark stain colored the snow beneath it. Fool creature, she whispered, but its patient suffering moved her. Taking a risk, she unbarred the door just enough to toss out a few scraps of meat. The wolf limped forward, gulped them down, and then retreated back into the shadows of the forest. Josiah returned the next day, dragging a sled loaded with fresh meat. She told him about the wolf. Probably chewed its own leg off to get out of a trap, he said. Then he looked at her, and there was clear approval in his eyes. You did right. A wounded wolf that close could bring the whole pack. Better to feed it and send it on its way. They worked together to butcher the elk, moving in a familiar, unspoken rhythm. When their hands brushed, neither of them pulled away. That night, as James slept, she found herself watching Josiah as he carved by the firelight. The harsh lines of his face were no longer frightening. They were just him. Thank you, she said quietly, for everything. He looked up, his dark eyes studying her. Boy needs a man's teaching. You need providing for. It's just practical. But she saw the lie. She saw it in the way he always cleaned his boots before coming inside, in the pine boughs he brought to freshen the air, in the endless patience he showed her son. This man wasn't just providing for her. In his own wild, unspoken way, he was courting her. Not with words, but with firewood. Not with flowers, but with fresh meat. He was proving his worth, teaching her strength, building a fortress around them in the heart of the mountains. And Margaret realized, with a terrifying jolt, that she was beginning to feel safe inside that fortress. She was beginning to feel like she belonged there. Spring came slowly, then all at once. The world turned from white to green, and the streams roared with melting snow. They fell into a comfortable routine. Josiah teaching James to track and fish. Margaret learning to garden in the rocky soil. It was a hard life, but it was a good life. Then one afternoon, the outside world returned. Margaret was alone in the cabin. Josiah and James were up in the high country, checking traps. She heard them first. Voices, men's voices, coming up the trail from the valley. She grabbed the spare rifle and barred the door, her heart pounding. Through the window she saw them. 3 rough-looking men on horseback, the kind that drift through the territory looking for trouble. "Hello, the cabin," one of them called out. "Looking for a little hospitality." She remained silent, hidden in the shadows. They dismounted and tried the door. Finding it barred, they laughed. "Come on now, we know you're in there. Sounds like a woman all alone." Fear, cold and familiar, clawed at her throat. These were men like the ones who had killed Thomas. "My husband will be back any minute," she called out, trying to deepen her voice. The leader laughed again. "Don't see no husband. Tracks show 1 man and a boy left hours ago. Plenty of time for us to get acquainted." They knew, they had read the signs. She was trapped. One of them started toward the window. She raised the rifle, letting him see the barrel. He recoiled, but he was still smiling. "Now, ma'am, no need for that. We're reasonable men." They started to ram the door with a log. The wood groaned, splintering. It wouldn't hold for long. Just as despair began to set in, she heard it, a sound from the forest behind the cabin. A long, low howl, but it wasn't a wolf. She knew that sound. It was Josiah. It was his signal. He was close. The men outside heard it too. They paused, looking nervously at the trees. "Wolves don't hunt in daylight," one of them said, but his voice trembled. Another howl answered, from a different direction. Then Margaret saw him, a shadow moving through the trees. Josiah. Their eyes met through the window. He held up 3 fingers, pointed at the men, and then pointed to himself. He was going to take all 3 of them. "Last warning," she yelled. "Leave now." The leader just laughed. "You threatening us, woman? You and what?" He never finished. Josiah exploded from the forest like an avenging spirit. His rifle boomed, and the leader's hat flew from his head. Before the other 2 could even draw their guns, Josiah was on them. He moved with a speed and fury that was terrifying to behold. He broke one man's arm with the butt of his rifle. He lifted the other off the ground by his throat. "Touch my family," he growled, his voice a sound that was barely human. "And I will feed you to the crows." They fled. Scrambling onto their horses, they galloped down the trail and didn't look back. Margaret unbarred the door, her legs shaking so badly she could barely stand. Josiah turned to her. "You hurt?" he asked gruffly. She shook her head, unable to speak. The rifle fell from her hands, and then she was sobbing. Great, wrenching sobs of fear and relief. Strong arms wrapped around her, pulling her against his solid chest. She clung to him, her tears soaking his buckskin shirt. He smelled of pine and safety. "You did good," he murmured, his hand patting her back awkwardly. "Real good." "Mama?" James appeared from the trees where Josiah had hidden him. He ran to them, wrapping his small arms around Josiah's leg. "You saved her." Josiah looked down at the boy, then at the woman in his arms. And in that moment, something profound shifted between them. The lines of captor and captive, of necessity and survival, blurred and vanished forever. That night, she couldn't stop trembling. The cabin, once a sanctuary, now felt vulnerable. Josiah spread his furs next to hers and James's. "Just for tonight," he said, "in case they come back." But they both knew it was more than that. In the darkness, she found his hand and squeezed it. He squeezed back. "Josiah," she whispered. "One of those men. I think he was one of the ones who killed Thomas." The silence stretched. "You want me to go after them?" he asked, his voice deadly calm. "I can catch them by dawn." She thought of revenge, of justice. Then she thought of James, sleeping peacefully beside them. "No," she said. "Let them go. We have what matters right here." His hand tightened on hers. They lay in silence, listening to the wind. For the first time, she felt a sense of peace. She had her own protector now, a man as wild and fierce as the mountains themselves. Just before she drifted off to sleep, she heard him whisper, so low she almost missed it. "Could have lost you today. Both of you. Can't let that happen." It was the closest he had ever come to saying what was in his heart, and it was enough. The incident with the drifters changed everything. The unspoken arrangement they lived by was no longer enough. Necessity finally drove them to town. "Boy needs proper boots," Josiah announced one morning, "and we need salt and ammunition." Margaret's stomach knotted with anxiety. Facing civilization again, facing the questions and the judgment, she wasn't ready. "We go together," she said, her voice firmer than she felt. He just nodded. Cedar Falls was a single muddy street lined with false front buildings. As they rode in, conversation stopped. People stared. The wild mountain man, the widow he'd taken, and the boy. She could feel their whispers like insects on her skin. At the general store, the proprietor looked at them with suspicion. "Need supplies," Josiah said, slapping a bundle of prime furs on the counter. "These are fine pelts," the man said, "but with you being who you are, and her—" "You saying my trade's no good?" Josiah's voice was a low rumble. "Perhaps the lady could wait outside," the man stammered. Before Margaret could react, Josiah's hand slammed down on the counter, making the man jump. "The lady shops where she pleases." Then the door opened, and the mayor's wife, a woman named Elmira Hartley, swept in. She took one look at Margaret and gasped. "Margaret Sullivan! How dare you show your face in decent society?" The store fell silent. "You call this a family?" she shrieked, pointing a finger at them. "Living in sin with this creature. What example are you setting for that poor child?" "The example of survival," Margaret said, her voice shaking but clear. "Enough." Josiah stepped forward, and Mrs. Hartley physically shrank back. "You sit in your warm house with your soft hands and you dare to judge this woman?" He boomed, his voice filling the store. "This woman has faced down storms, and wolves and men who would do her harm. She's raised a fine boy. She's stronger than any 10 of you put together. Her life is worth more than all your empty propriety." Mrs. Hartley was speechless. Just then, the town reverend, a kind-faced man named Paul Morrison, entered. "What's all this commotion?" He looked at Margaret not with judgment, but with gentle concern. "Mrs. Sullivan, it's good to see you and young James." Then he turned to the silent crowd. "I hear someone has been leaving venison on the widow Cooper's doorstep all winter. I hear a mountain man taught young Tim Fletcher how to set snares when his pa was laid up. It seems to me that actions speak louder than gossip. Judge not, lest ye be judged." A few people in the crowd had the grace to look ashamed. "You are all welcome in my church," the Reverend said, looking directly at them. "Anytime." "Appreciate that, Reverend," Josiah said gruffly. "But the mountains are our church." That night, camped on the trail home, Margaret couldn't sleep. The town had stirred up too much. She was standing by the creek when Josiah appeared silently beside her. "What that woman said," she began. "About us. What are we, Josiah?" He was quiet for a long time, watching the water. "Told you the first night. Mountain law. Is that still what this is?" she asked, turning to face him. "Am I still your property?" He looked at her, and in the moonlight she saw the struggle in his eyes. "Started that way," he admitted, his voice rough. "Simple. But it ain't simple no more. You're not just the woman. You're Margaret. And I'd die before I let harm come to you or the boy." It was the most beautiful thing he had ever said. Tears welled in her eyes. "Josiah! Mama! Pa!" James's frightened voice came from the campfire. "There's something in the woods." They rushed back to find him pointing at a pair of glowing eyes in the darkness. Josiah relaxed, a low chuckle rumbling in his chest. "It's just an old friend." Into the firelight limped the wolf, the same one she had fed months ago. Its paw was healed, though it still walked with a limp. It looked at them, then settled down just outside the circle of light, as if standing guard. "He's been following us since we left the cabin," Josiah said. "Keeping watch. You showed him kindness. Now he's part of our pack." Margaret looked at the wild guardian, at her son, at the mountain man who had just laid his heart bare. They were a pack, a strange, broken, and beautiful pack. The town could whisper all it wanted. Here in the wilderness, they had found their truth. In the darkness, her hand found his. "Thank you," she whispered, "for defending me." "Always, Margaret," he answered. "Always." Weeks later, disaster struck. James came down with a fever, a terrible raging fever that left him delirious and weak. "It's mountain fever," Josiah said, his face grim. "He needs a doctor." "I'll go," he said, pulling on his coat. "You stay with him. I'll be back by nightfall." "Ride fast," was all she could whisper. The day was an eternity of cool cloths and whispered prayers. The fever wouldn't break. As dusk fell, James began calling out for his papa, for Thomas. Then he started calling for someone else. "Pa, pa, want pa," he mumbled, reaching a weak hand not towards Margaret, but towards the empty doorway. He was calling for Josiah. Just as the sun set, she heard horses. Josiah was back, and he'd brought the doctor and Reverend Morrison with him. "It's bad," the doctor said after examining James. "The next few hours are critical." As the doctor worked, the Reverend spoke quietly to Josiah. "This is why the boy needs civilization. What if the passes had been snowed in? He needs a school. He needs other children." Margaret's heart clenched. He was right. Was it fair to raise James in such isolation? The doctor and Reverend left medicine and prayers, then departed back to town. The long vigil began. Near midnight, the fever spiked. James thrashed, crying out. He wouldn't take the medicine. "Pa!" he cried, his voice thin and reedy. "Papa!" Josiah froze. Then, with a look of raw anguish on his face, he gathered the boy into his massive arms. "I'm here, son," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "Pa's here. You fight this thing. You hear me? You're a mountain boy. You're strong." James quieted at the sound of his voice, allowing them to give him the medicine. Josiah held him for hours, rocking him and telling him stories of the mountains, his deep voice a calming rumble. Margaret watched, tears streaming down her face. The man who had claimed her body had just claimed her son's heart. He was no longer just a protector. He was a father. Just before dawn, she woke from a light doze. She touched James's forehead. It was cool. The fever had broken. "Thank God," she breathed. Josiah's own eyes were suspiciously wet. James opened his eyes, clear for the first time in days. "Mama? Pa?" he whispered and smiled. Later that day, Josiah stood by the window, looking out at the peaks that were his home. "The Reverend was right," he said. "The boy needs more. We can't keep him up here, isolated." He turned to her, his face serious. "We could build a new place, closer to town. Still in the mountains, but close enough for school, for a doctor. A place that's ours, from the start." Margaret's heart swelled. "You would do that? Give up your solitude?" He stepped closer, cupping her face in his big calloused hands. "For you, for the boy, family. Family makes a man do things. Is that what we are?" she whispered. "A family?" "What else would you call it?" he said, his voice soft. "He calls me Pa. And you?" He struggled for the words. "You're everything." She rose on her toes and kissed him. A real kiss, full of tears and hope, and a love that had grown against all odds. He rested his forehead against hers. "Marry me, Margaret," he said, his voice a rough whisper. "Not because of mountain law, because I love you, because I can't imagine my life without you and the boy in it." "Yes," she breathed. "Yes, Josiah Reed, I will marry you." A small voice piped up from the bed. "Does this mean Mr. Josiah is really my pa now?" They turned to see James watching them, a weak grin on his face. "Yes," Josiah said, his voice thick. "It does." "Can we have a real wedding?" James asked. "With cake?" "Biggest cake in the territory," Josiah promised. That evening, as they sat on the porch, their wolf guardian watching from the steps, they planned their future. A new cabin. A new life that bridged the wildness of the mountains and the community of the town. "I have something for you," Josiah said. He disappeared inside and returned with a small box. Inside was a ring, carved from elk antler and inlaid with a thin band of gold from his own panning. "It's not fancy," he said. "It's perfect," she whispered, sliding it onto her finger. The valley Josiah chose was perfect, cradled between two ridges with a clear stream running through it. They built the new cabin themselves, with help from some of the townsfolk who had come to respect them. The wedding was a simple affair, held in the meadow beside their new home. Reverend Morrison officiated. A handful of friends from town and the wilderness stood as witnesses. Margaret wore a new blue dress. Josiah had trimmed his beard. James stood between them, beaming. When the Reverend asked Josiah if he took this woman to be his wife, his "I do" was a vow that echoed off the mountains. And when Margaret looked into Josiah's eyes and said, "I do," she knew she had found her true home. That night on the porch of their new house, James returned from feeding the wolf a piece of wedding cake. He held up a perfect obsidian arrowhead he'd found by the stream. "These mountains have seen many people," Josiah told him, "but this is our home now. We're part of it." Later, lying beside her husband in their new bed, Margaret felt a sense of peace she had never known. "Josiah," she whispered, "are you happy?" He was quiet for a moment. "I spent 8 years alone. I thought I was content. I was a fool. This, you, the boy, this is what I was waiting for." His hand came to rest gently on her stomach. "Margaret, are you?" "It's early," she said, her voice filled with joy. "But I think so." He went very still. "A baby? Our baby?" He kissed her then, a kiss filled with all the wonder and joy in the world. "You've given me back my life, Margaret Reed," he said. "We gave each other back our lives," she corrected. "That's what love does." Outside, their wolf sang to the moon. Inside, their new cabin was filled with warmth and light. The journey had been brutal. It had started with death and despair, with a wild man's shocking claim in a frozen wasteland. But it had led them here, to family, to home. The mountains had tested them, broken them down, and then rebuilt them into something stronger, something more beautiful than before. Their story wasn't a fairy tale of happily ever after. It was something real. They had made a good life in a hard place, and that was better than any fairy tale. Thank you for joining us on this journey into the wild heart of the frontier. If you enjoyed Margaret and Josiah's story, please let us know in the comments below. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more tales of survival, love, and the untamed American West. Your support helps us keep these stories alive.